And recording is on.
Perfecto. Okay. So thank you everybody for your time today. I'm going to talk about our new attack simulation training that was recently introduced into our Microsoft Defender for Office 365 Plan 2 suite. We previously had an attack simulator solution before. We'll leave it at that. We've made some amazing improvements into what the overall platform is here to do for you to kind of help from the end user training perspective, as well as just to get some visibility into what is our susceptibility within our organization look like. So this is all around really building out that, and I hate to use it, but it's kind of a marketing term, but it makes sense to a degree, but the human firewall, right? We're empowering our end users to understand and look for threats before they actually become threats. So attack simulation training really starts to drive in on that, where it gives us the ability to do simulated attacks within our own organization that we can manage and control, leveraging safe and non-weaponized techniques. And then more importantly, ends with training based on the actual user actions that they've taken within the simulated training or the simulated attack, which is pretty awesome. And then from an administrator perspective, it really helps to kind of put into a picture-esque view, if you will, of what does your organization look like from a susceptibility perspective as it relates to things like credential harvesting or malware attachments and so forth. To start off with, the one big change that you'll see right out of the gate, if you've seen our previous attack simulator, is just the dashboard, right? There's a lot more useful information as we start to look into this. Now, obviously, this is a demo tenant. It's relatively a new demo tenant, so there's not a whole lot going on. So the reports are kind of bleh. But you can see how this can be very useful from just a quick at-a-glance kind of scenario. Starting in the top left is just our simulations that we've recently run and what their kind of status is and the type of simulation that we run. And moving over to the right is things start to get a little interesting. This is based on the actual simulations that we've run in the past and simulations that have run across other global Office 365 tenants that are leveraging the same solutions and the same types of attacks that you are, to give you some insights into what does Microsoft think your predicted compromise rate is going to be versus what the actual compromise rate is based off the simulations that your users go through. So say we've predicted that we'll see a 25% chance that your users within any given training or attack simulation will be susceptible to both click and providing credentials. And then they actually go through it. Maybe they clicked on it, but didn't necessarily provide the credentials. We then start to adjust that to give you some insights into what your specific predicted compromise rate will look like as you continue to use the platform. We then also start to give more insights into what the simulation coverage looks like. And this is kind of relating back to the human firewall efforts that we're seeing organizations really pick up on. And the previous one, you really had to manually track who was in a simulation, which ones did you launch, when did you launch them. It was kind of a pain. This now helps to give you really quick insights into how many users are left within my organization that have not gone through at least one simulation. And then you can pull reports, create CSVs, and use that as a means to create a new simulation based on those user groups that maybe haven't gone through one in quite a while. And we'll talk about some new automations to help with that as well. Next piece there is the training completion. There's nothing really crazy about that. Obviously, it's just did the users who went through the attack simulations go through their training if training was required. So who completed, who's still in progress, or who's incomplete. This way you can leverage the completion report as a means of follow-up for those users who maybe didn't actually go through the training when you set it as a requirement. Another interesting, useful tidbit here is the repeat offenders. And there's some things that we can do and student-to-be can do within the attack simulation training portal as it relates to repeat offenders. So essentially by default, if somebody fails a simulation twice consecutively, they're considered a repeat offender. And you can adjust that number as well based on your own requirements. But this gives you a specific grouping of people that you can use and target for additional simulations moving forward for those who continuously keep seeming to fall for the same thing, right? Maybe the training's not necessarily working for them, or they're on the incomplete training list as well. This way you can start to really hone in on exactly what is going to work best for them before you start, pulling people in from the HR team. The last piece there is an overall recommendation list, and you'll see recommendations listed in each simulation that you run as well, with the recommendations adjusting based on the outcome and the type of payload that you've selected, or attack method, I should say. But generally what it does is it ties back into the Microsoft Secure Score and gives you recommendations on how to kind of mitigate the risk that it's seeing within your overall environment based on the simulations that you are conducting. And so obviously any adjustments or changes that you make based on those recommendations will completely or will automatically sync and correlate back to the Secure Score that it's representing, and then adjust your score from there as well. So let's dive into the simulations. So I've got a few that I've already had run just so we have things to look at. So we'll come back to this Cred Harvest 3.1 as that was one I ran obviously yesterday, but we're going to start with a new one first just to kind of get a feel of what we can do. When we launch our simulations, and I apologize, my cat just woke up, so now she wants to be a part of it, so she might step on my keyboard, I apologize. But the first thing we can do here is select our attack technique. Today, these are the currently available ones with more coming down the pipe here shortly. I can't share specifically which ones we're going to see, but there's some pretty cool ones coming down that I'm pretty excited about. But for now, we have a good amount that we can start to play around with. Most popular one is going to be the Credential Harvest. So think of this as your standard go-to where a user receives an email, they click on a link, and it's meant to look or masquerade as a legitimate login website or page, very similar to the Office 365 standard vanilla branding for Azure AD. The intent here is to see, one, did the user click on the link? Two, did they enter any information and submit it? And then from there, it reports back and kind of gives you some insights there. The malware attachment is simply that. We attach an attachment to an email, and we look to see if the user actually went through with opening up the attachment, with the attachment being quote unquote malicious. And again, these are not weaponized by any means, so there's no harm if they do actually open this. But the idea here is to see, based on the email message that they received, did they trust it enough to open up an attachment from that unknown source? And then link and attachment is very similar to malware attachment. The difference here being is that it's simply just a means of providing another URL for the user to click on to then most likely be taken to something like a credential harvesting page or even a drive-by URL. And then same thing to a link to malware. You can see these three are very similar in nature, but all have kind of a different end result, if you will, with link to malware being more of trying to leverage something that's a legitimate sharing source, such as SharePoint or Dropbox, where the actual attachment or download that comes from that would be something like malware rather than attaching it directly to the email. And then the last one that we can leverage here is drive-by URL. This one is a little bit more interesting, but it's essentially where it's designed to mimic the attack where you might see a cloned website or an actual compromised website. So think I scalped chase.com as a bank, and I recreated that on my own, and its intent is to leverage malicious code on the back end, or even still tie into credential harvesting techniques, or it might be something, like I mentioned before, where the actual website itself has been compromised. If it's a mom and pop shop and they leverage that store quite a bit, or whatever the case might be, that's what the drive-by URL is going to represent. We're going to stick with Credential Harvest for walking through this here. You're going to give it a name. Now, I'm not going to save this, so I'm just going to put Cred for now. But obviously, you want to leverage good simulation names just to kind of help you keep track of everything. Obviously, descriptions are always highly recommended and welcomed, but we're going to skip that in the demo fashion. Next option here is to select your payload. So this is basically based on, or basically templates that Microsoft has actually pulled from real life attacks across many millions of M365 tenants across the globe, where obviously they have been scraped of any sort of identifying information if there were any, but the templates themselves were leveraged so that we can actually depict real life use cases or examples of what these attacks might look like. We can, of course, click on any one of these. So if we look at something like a document share, we can actually see a preview here on the side of what this is going to look like before we actually commit to going through with the entire thing. So we can see a small snippet of what the HTML is going to look like, and we can get some information as far as where did this template come from. So we can see if it's global, it's trying to represent or mimic the brand of Microsoft. We get some information on the email subjects. And then we can even see all related simulations that have launched leveraging the same payload. This is useful as it's a great way for you to kind of start to understand and leverage other simulations that you haven't quite gone through yet. And you can see some of that here. And also a really quick tip, if you've gone through this before but haven't seen this, is to leverage the filters. Because you can also look for specific sources as you start to create your own payloads, which we'll talk about, but also complexity, which is pretty awesome. Complexity is a means of us helping to give hints to the users when they're looking at the email. Higher complexity means that we're leveraging less hints. So it's starting to look more and more like a realistic email. Whereas a low complexity means that we're giving them lots of hints. We are just dropping hints left and right. We might as well just write out, this is a fake email. And then medium, obviously right in the middle. But then you can also filter by theme and so forth. And this is especially useful as you start to create your own as well. But right back on the page here, we can also see just out of the gate, how effective has this been in my previous simulations? So ones that have 0, obviously, are ones we haven't leveraged before. And ones that we have leveraged before, we'll see what the click rate was based on the previous simulations, and it's an overall average. So this is really great as we start to look at what is it that we're going to do next. We can create a payload directly from the simulation as well. We're going to do this separately, so we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But for now, we're going to go ahead and go forward with a document share. Next up is selecting your target users. You can include all users in your organization. There is a limit. I think it's up to 40,000 users in a tenant can be selected all at once. Obviously, we default to specific users and groups for a reason. You can do individual users. You can use groups that you've created within Azure Active Directory as well. And then we've also got these kind of curated lists that start to pop up and become a little bit more useful in a non-demo tenant, where you can pull things, say, if you have specific cities that you're looking for, or in the cases of departments within education institutions, you can use that as well if you want to select all of IT or all of HR, and you can leverage titles as well. And then you'll start to see the suggested users and groups come up, and this is where that repeat offenders piece kind of starts to come into light as well, which is pretty useful. So if we only want to focus on those who have hit that 2 or more threshold, we can very quickly target them as well. In this case, we're going to look at just Sherry, who is ironically in HR. She looks at a lot of cat pictures sometimes, and sometimes it's not a real cat picture. So we're going to go ahead and choose Sherry and go next. The next step is one of the biggest enhancements that we've seen come through in our attack simulation training from the previous attack simulator. And this is where we now provide, in partnership with Terranova, pre-curated training at no additional cost within the licensing that you get as part of MDO Plan 2, which is awesome. And so what we can do here is a couple different things. One is we can choose, do we want to have training or not? We can say we want to leverage the Microsoft training experience. We can say no training at all. We're just wanting to do the simulation. And rolling out as we speak is the ability to redirect to a custom URL. So if you're not wanting to leverage the built-in training experience, but you have your own training portal or you've got your own LMS that you're leveraging for internal training as well, you can actually choose redirect to a custom URL and have the service just redirect into those trainings. Now, obviously, there's no true direct integration there, so you do still have to do a manual assignment that way. Or have predefined trainings that they're going to have to go through. But the option is rolling out, which is pretty awesome. But if you do use the built-in training experience, you can allow Microsoft, based on the payload that you chose and the technique that you've chosen, what training should be assigned. And Microsoft will automatically curate that list for you and assign it to the users in the simulation. We also have the ability to do that on our own, which we are going to choose just so you kind of see what that list looks like. And then we can choose our due date. So when the simulation ends, so simulations basically have a buffer where they'll completely end. So anybody who hasn't gone through it, they'll be an incomplete essentially because they didn't do anything, they didn't get compromised or anything like that. And then everybody else will fall into the bucket of training. So 7 days after the simulation ends, 30 days and so forth, not currently customizable beyond what you see here today. It is something that I've seen customers ask for in the past, but just know these are the options for at the moment. So we're going to just choose 7 days for fun. So next up is the actual, since we want to see our trainings and choose on our own, we have this trainings assignment list. Now, the recommended tab is actually showing you, based on the payload and the technique that I chose, these are what Microsoft would have chosen for you on your behalf if you had said just leverage Microsoft recommended training. So this is great for you to see what Microsoft thinks would be appropriate. And then we can actually either just choose one or many. And we can even just get a quick preview, which I find very useful if we want to just get an idea of what does the training look like? Is it something we want to take advantage of in this specific thing? We can go through the whole walkthrough, play the video and so forth without actually having to assign ourselves to a simulation and actually go through the training. This lets us skip all that, which is great. We're going to just choose 2 here for the time being, but really quick, the all trainings tab is essentially all the training that's available to you as part of the Terranova integration and partnership. Now, this does filter a little bit based on what we're doing in this specific attack simulation, and you will see this list potentially grow in the future as our integrations with Terranova continue to grow. And then obviously there is the concept, if you wish, to work directly with Terranova to obviously expand on the training material directly with them as well outside of the platform. But for now, again, we're going to just choose these two. Now, a really quick feature that I really like is we may not want to inundate all of the users that are in a simulation with training if they didn't really fall for anything. And so this allows us to dynamically choose who's actually going to be assigned this training based on what happened. So we can say, for example, maybe the email one's actually short. In this case, it's not. They're both the same amount of time, but maybe it was only a minute long. We might say anybody in our simulation has to go through that training just because we want them to be aware of it. But for the one that maybe is longer, right, or more important to what happened, we can actually say if they actually clicked the payload but weren't actually compromised, or if they clicked the payload and were compromised, we want only those people to actually have to go through this training. So everybody else who didn't fall for it, all they get is that 1 minute training or no training at all. Meanwhile, everybody else who actually fell for it does have to go through it, which is pretty awesome. We then have the ability to do a landing page. So this is what happens once the user falls for the compromise. So this is the default Microsoft landing page. There's not a whole lot of customization here at the moment. You can do the header, which is this guy here, and then the body. Everything else is pre-built by Microsoft, including the logo. And yes, we've got feedback on that, I promise you. What this will do, though, is it'll show the templates of the attack itself, and then it'll actually walk them through some hints based on that complexity level that Microsoft provided in the simulation that they could have used as a way to identify this as a malicious email. And then obviously the go-to training. Now you do have the ability soon to do a custom landing page URL. So you can build your own landing page that you can leverage, whether it's in SharePoint Online or your website or whatever the case might be. You do have the ability soon to actually leverage that as well. Do a quick time check. I'm going to start speeding up a little bit here. Launch details is we launch it as soon as we're done, or we can schedule to launch it another time. So if we're bored on a Friday night and we're enjoying our beverage and we're like, hey, we're going to do some simulations, we can save all of them for Monday morning, which is awesome. And then again, configure how long the simulation has to run before it automatically ends. And then enable region-aware times of delivery. Not so much really useful in education a lot of times, because a lot of our students and staff faculty are pretty much in the same area to a degree, but can be useful. So essentially, it'll leverage whatever the user has set as their time zone within OA as a means to deliver the email. So we're not sending an email to somebody on the East Coast when we're sending it at 9 a.m., PST or Central or whatever the case might be. It takes that into account. And then from there, we simply just, we're going to do launch now. We hit next, we review everything. We can send a test to the person who's currently creating the simulation so we can see what everything's going to look like before we commit. And if we don't want to do that, we can just hit submit. And then what happens from there is we then actually kick off the simulation. So running through this, you'll see it's very much similar to what we saw on the homepage as far as the reporting dashboard goes, but now it's specific to this actual simulation. The difference here is we're going to start to see specifics as to what users were compromised by entering their credentials, because this was a credential harvesting technique, and I used a specific payload for email quarantine notification. And then we can actually see user activity. So we can see, was it successfully delivered? Well, that's great. It actually made it to their mailbox. That's awesome. Did the user report it, leveraging the native built-in report capability within OA or the Outlook client and so forth? And then did they click it? And if they clicked it, more importantly, did they supply their credentials? So we can see in this simulation that of the two users this was sent to, they both appear to have clicked it, but only one of them actually provided their credentials. And we can dive into the depths of the report to see specifics on who did what. And then we can even see just at a glance who started the training and who has not. The improvement actions, as I mentioned before, this is now scoped specifically to this simulation as far as what from Secure Score will help to mitigate the overall risk related to the compromise, the payload, and the technique. So if we look at the user experience really quick, and then we'll go back to kind of some more admin level stuff, you can see here that this was the one that was sent out yesterday. And I made some mistakes on how I was doing my template, but I apologize. But this is also a low complexity. So some of these are actually intentional as a means of showing the user that something's not quite right with the template. So you can see here that it did leverage her display name correctly, Sherry, but there's some other things that were amiss. But Sherry still wanted to click on this, and she's going to click on release. And since the simulation is still active, we should get to it. Perfect. And this is the simulated portal that's meant to look like a Microsoft sign-in page, but we can obviously see that it is not a Microsoft URL, even though it is HTTPS, right? So that's another great thing. Now, Sherry can just type in her actual stuff, but just so you all know, you can type anything here in reality, and it's going to go through. Now, an important thing to note that if a user does actually type in their username and password, nothing is cached, nothing is stored, nothing is actually transferred over the pipe for that. It is simply dropped. So there is no risk of credential leakage from that perspective. So that's all good there. Now, from a reporting side, though, if the user doesn't actually type in a username and password, they just do what I did, it is still going to show that they typed something in, because that's all it's really checking for is, did something get typed into those two fields? So just kind of keep that in mind. But once they fall for the compromise, I don't want to save my fake password. This is where I was saying you can see that it brings us to our default landing page, and then starts to walk them through the various tips that are available to them that they could have leveraged to understand, this is how I could have seen that something was amiss within this template. And you can customize these if you wish. You can copy the template and create your own, and then add additional tagging, which is what we call these dynamic tags, so that it walks them through a bit more. And then obviously the go-to training portal. So we're going to click on that. This is basically a watered down version of the security.microsoft.com portal that's specific to the user being able to see their assigned training. As this loads up for me here. So what Sherry will see are the trainings that were listed as part of the attack simulation that we had that I had conducted yesterday. And then all she has to do is click on the one that she was assigned. And because she was only assigned the phishing one for if she clicked and was compromised, that's the one that's brought up. And she can walk through it. She has to finish it. She can go through part of it. If she clicks out of it, it does not show as a complete until she goes through the entire thing. And then I believe this is the reminder. Perfect. I was hoping this came through. And then you do have the ability to turn on reminders for the training. This is off by default, I believe, but you can allow Microsoft to automatically bug the end users that were part of the simulation to go through the training. This is a great way, especially since the portal is not necessarily something that they have easy access to per se. It's not something they go to all the time for the training side. So this gives them a nice, easy click of a button kind of perspective. All right. So let's quickly run through the payloads here. So payloads are, again, those templates, right? That's what we're going to provide to the end user as a means of trying to trick them into doing something like provide their credentials. So these are all the pre-built templates that are provided by Microsoft as part of the service. Again, all leveraged and sourced from real-time attacks and then retemplatized here for you. Now, of course, you can take any one of these and copy them, so the ones directly from Microsoft, and create your own customized version of that if you wish, which is a great way to kind of get your feet wet. You can also create your own custom payload. Out of the box or out of the gate, you'll see that we have some other types here that are not quite available. Not a whole lot of information just yet as far as when you'll see these come to life, but just know that these are things that Microsoft is currently thinking about as we start looking towards other forms of phishing like smishing and vishing and so forth. And you'll see a big focus on IM as well coming forward. But for now, all we can do is email. And then same as when we're creating our simulation, we choose a technique that we want to tie this payload to. So we're going to, again, keep it with Credential Harvest, but you can choose any one of these. We give it a name, we give it a description, and then we start to configure everything. So we give it a name from a sender's name perspective, from an email perspective, and subject. Now you can use an internal name and email address if you wish to, as far as adding to complexity to give to help train users on what internal threats might look like. So potentially compromised users, not so much phishing at that point. Or you can put in just about anything as you wish from an email and name perspective here. You would then choose a phishing link. So these are all the different URLs that are provided by Microsoft as a means of safe attack simulations that are predefined for you. So you just choose whichever one you want to leverage. You can add tags to this overall template as far as what it's going to be aimed at. And then you can start to build out the theme based on what Microsoft pre-provides for you. And you can start to you can actually build it out via HTML or import your own HTML code if you've already got one branded. And then these are all the metadata that you would associate that we would see within the details pane. And I don't think it's going to let me go through because I'm not finishing it. So I'm not going to go through everything, but essentially, maybe it's just this one here. So in the add indicators, it's essentially where we then provide those hints. And so that's what will determine the overall complexity of the payload that we're leveraging. The more hints, the lower the complexity, the less hints, obviously the higher the complexity. And it's also a means for the service to understand what should be leveraged as far as hints moving forward when they actually hit that landing page. Once that's done and you save and close it, the payload will be available for use based on the technique that you assigned it to. And then you'll be able to leverage it in any of your future simulations that you leverage moving forward. So I talked about some new things coming down the pipe for automations. So this is a new feature that is currently rolling out as well. So you may or may not see this already in your tenant if you've got the licensing available already. But what this allows us to do now is randomize and pre-schedule our simulations ahead of time. So earlier we saw that we can manually create a simulation, we can choose our own users, all that fun stuff, and we can schedule it for later, and that's great. What this actually does is take us to the next step. So we have the concept of we want to potentially target either a specific group of users or any user in an organization, but in different methods and randomize it. So we can get around the whole water cooler effect, where if we send a simulation to the same group of users and they're all working in the same cubicle, or they're always talking on Teams because we're in remote work, one of them might get the attack simulation and the other ones are like, oh, hey, did you get this? And they'll confirm it's fake, and so they don't do anything about it. And that kind of hurts our results. This allows us to select multiple types of techniques and actually go through and choose either our manual payloads that we want to leverage or randomize, so that any user within the simulations may potentially get a different form of the payload, even a different technique altogether. And then again, we can still select specific users that we want or allow it to pick at random users within our organization. But this is really a really great use case for specific departmental or interdepartmental or multiple departments where we want to have multiple simulations run at any given time in a random fashion. So again, we're going to just choose Sherry just for the sake of the demo. Make sure I try and stay on time here. And then same thing, just like before, we choose our training experience and how we want that to look. We're going to leave it as assigned for me. And then the landing page right now is limited to our Microsoft internal landing page. You can't use your custom one at the moment. We'll see how that looks moving forward. But for right now, you just customize the header and the body. And then the simulation schedule. So we can still do a fixed schedule where we choose exactly when and how we want this to look, or we can do a randomized schedule, which is what we're going to choose here. So we still tell it when to start. And then we can choose what days of the week do we want this to actually take place. Do we want it to happen potentially on a Saturday or on a Wednesday or a Tuesday or all three of those, but not necessarily send anything out on Monday, Thursday, Friday, Sunday, and so forth? We have the ability to do that. We then choose how many simulations on any given day do we want to kind of kick off and go forward through from the start to the end. So we have a limit of between 1 to 10, so we're going to choose 10, excuse me. We can also randomize the send times, which again is back to that water cooler effect. So people don't always get it at the same exact time. So it looks a little bit more natural, which is fantastic. And then we just choose when we want the simulation to end. And just like that, we then have a little bit more details we can go forward with using unique payloads, or again, targeting those repeat offenders, and then similar to what I mentioned before with the region-aware delivery. And once we choose those, we are good to launch the simulation, and it'll kick off automatically for us and randomize based on the settings that we've configured, which is pretty awesome. The last automation we can take advantage of is our payload harvesting. This is a really cool feature. What this allows us to essentially do is within our own tenant, since we're leveraging Defender for Office 365, is actually have conditions where we can look and monitor for specific phishing attack campaigns that take place against our own organization and users. So we can say if this sender is from a specific email or a specific domain, or if the users that are receiving the phishing attacks are a part of a specific group, maybe all of our VIP users or C-levels and so forth, we can use it as a condition. And what this essentially means is that when a phishing campaign takes place and we see it through the MDO portal, we then have the ability for the attack simulation training to actually scrape that real life incident and create a payload for you automatically. This way you can reuse it moving forward if the users were susceptible to compromise, if it did get through the various checks within MDO or whatever the case might be, you can use it as a training means moving forward to help users identify something that actually took place not too long ago within their own organization. And this is a great way to help you do that without having to manually copy it down and import it like we saw when you create a payload yourself. That is, in a nutshell, the attack simulation training. As you can see here, it really is driven around helping to build out that human firewall, end user education, as well as giving you additional insights into what does susceptibility look like within the organization, all within the safety and confines of Microsoft 365.
And I'm sure as long as you're not going after your C-level people, it'll probably bring a little bit of happiness to your life too. Does anybody have any questions? We just have a few moments left. Nick, great job as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
There was nothing in the chat. And if nobody has any questions, we'll bid everybody adieu and say go Islanders and see everybody in 2 weeks.
Best of luck, Steve. I know your heart's in it, brother.
Thank you very much. All right, everybody, have a great day. Again, Nick, awesome job. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, that was great, man. Thank you.